This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's the 24th of January, 21. I'm going to do something on walking today. There are all sorts of things that you miss when you drive, when you run. So I thought I'd leave my building. There used to be a pocket prairie across the road. It's been subsumed by development, but the plants have gone to detention pond on 2nd Street, which is just a few blocks away. So I walk there often to exercise, but also to check out on the prairie plants. I'm in the street. The street has a tent for a restaurant to waylay the virus, and the bar across the road is closed. And people are wearing their masks outside. I passed the MTD building, which is the site where all buses come together. And I walk up the road past 3 buses parked, waiting for designations. And I walk through a parking lot. And the parking lot has little mounds of snow left from the last snowstorm. And it reminded me of a poem that was written by Robert Frost, and he was quite a gentleman, and he mistook a crumpled up newspaper for a lump of snow, and this is what he wrote. There's a patch of old snow in the corner that I should have guessed was a blow-away paper the rain had brought to rest. It is speckled with grime as if small print overspread it. The news of the day I've forgotten, if I ever read it. That's a simple little poem, but yes, the leftover snow can sometimes be dirty, sometimes be filled with junk, but the parking lot is quite neat and tidy, and the snow was legitimate, leaking out onto the ground. I went past an automobile shop, a repair shop, and a plastic joint. Across the road to a coffee shop, and then nearby there's an antique store, and I look in the window at the objects, and just a little further down there's a Mexican restaurant that's closed, but I have a wonderful cactus in the window, and cactus often bloom at night, but this one was blooming during the day. I could photograph it through the window. Just little things. So I went on to the detention pond. The detention pond, for those who don't realize it, is an attempt to capture stormwater and hold it so that it doesn't flood the commercial areas downstream. This is a particularly large detention pond with 2 ponds, one's more shallow than others. But the Boneyard Creek that comes through is allowed to drop down with a number of waterfalls, and these waterfalls manage to uh, aerate the water, and the bigger pond is attractive to geese and ducks and herons, and it's almost like a miniature zoo. So I started off at University Avenue, which is a major federal highway, as well as a well used street. So the boneyard comes through under the street in a huge, uh, probably 8 foot tall um, pipe, might be two. Uh, and you can stand on the usual ground level and look down on the stream as it comes out from under the uh, University Avenue. Uh, Behind uh, the spot where you can look out is a horticultural garden, which is largely a prairie, but it's on top of this concrete pipe, so it does not get water from the stream. It gets water from the runoff of the streets nearby. And so it is a rain garden. It has flag lilies or iris in the impounded area. Uh, it has cardinal plants, which are very much attuned to water. And then it has uh, drop seed and a number of broadleaf plants, especially clovers and uh, asters, which come late in the season. And it's a rather nice little garden, horticulturally specialized garden, not so much a natural garden, although it has all the elements of nature. So I walk around there and enjoy seeing whether the frost has hit the last of the asters. And yes, even the frost aster has succumbed to the winter. And the temperature is cool, probably about 30 degrees. So I'm walking uh, with large strides. The well health people suggest that you move your legs and body uh, fairly extensively because it activates the muscles, and the muscles activate the rest of the body and the brain, and so exercise is rather wonderful if you can do it. Uh, so I walk around the first pond and get across White Street. I have to be careful that I'm not going to be run down by bus or cars, and I'm doing making it to the deeper pond, which is favored by uh, ducks that like meadows and swampland, and geese, and herons that occasionally stand still and wait to catch a fish. Uh, my cell phone rings. It's my sister from Australia. She is organizing a art gallery show on my behalf in Australia, and she needs titles. So I'm being talked to uh, fairly directly. I keep walking because it is cold, and I also am exercising. And I'm interested in the ducks and geese. They're rather wonderful. They have a language of their own. They interact with each other. So every once in a while, uh, one duck will almost purposefully uh, move through a crowd of ducks. So I watch these things, and there are people who feed the ducks and geese, and that has some sort of power to it because food is so essential that the creatures will come right up to you and ask for bread. And sometimes, if you don't provide it, they can get rather antsy because they get used to it. So the city people and the park people who have to work with the wildlife that come to detention ponds beg people not to feed the creatures because, in the first place, the plot gets known, the pond gets known, so you get more species and more of each species. And uh, then it gets to be a little messy because the creatures uh, tend to defecate on the trails, which are nice trails, but makes them rather sloppy. And they're also uh, ground feeders. So in a nicely mown lawn, they go for little shoots and can easily create an erosion problem. So I watch what's going on, and sometimes I remind people that if they feed like that, then eventually there'll be so many creatures that the city or park district or whoever is in control will bring in people to exterminate some. And that happened recently, and about much to the chagrin of people who were enjoying those creatures and uh, wishing to preserve them. But you have to think about creating detention ponds that attract the creatures. And so the humans have made a site, and the wildlife is acting naturally. But if people come along with a loaf of bread and throw it out, you get an aggregation of all these creatures in one place. They seem to do pretty well with each other. Geese are much larger, the Canadian geese, and the ducks are smaller. But they're little enclaves. There are three white ducks, which I suspect are commercial ducks. Uh, that always together, but liberated enough that one can go off and uh, dive for what's in the mud. Uh, these are creatures that uh, enjoy these sorts of ponds. The geese are bigger and have longer necks, so they can actually float in the water and put their heads down without necessarily turning themselves up. The ducks aren't quite so fortunate. They have to turn themselves right up. They don't dive. But you can see them working uh, their feet, their web feet, uh, to get down in the mud, and then they will come up. And sometimes uh, they will uh, have a burst of wings to sort of settle down after diving. But uh, if necessary and it's deeper, they will dive. I was interested to note that part of this pond has frozen, and for some reason, the ducks and the geese uh, seem to harvest something along the perimeter of the ice. One doesn't know, but that's the sort of thing where you ask a question and and you keep watching, and you find out what has attracted some uh, specimen of food, perhaps to be near the edge of the ice. None of these creatures climb up on the ice because it's thin enough that it would break, and they're knowledgeable enough that they stay in the water, not on the ice. But some few, especially geese, will walk on the ice, and they're a little bit like humans. The ice gets slippery, and you can see them slipping as they walk with their web feet, usually in pairs. Geese, especially, are in pairs. They're sort of joined for life, and but they keep roaming for other open spaces or other sources of food. And at first, I thought that these geese were standing on a high ground that was just covered a little bit with water. But then I realized by the way they were walking and sliding across the ice that uh, this was frozen ice and they were walking on it and enjoying. They had enough liberality in their couple sip that they could move apart to find specimens of food. I watched to see a little row of rocks, which in summertime is a prime place for geese, especially to sometimes stand on one leg or uh, sit on the rock and sun themselves. But in winter, the rocks are free of any creatures. I walk around past an open air theater where bands can play, and uh, they go past little eating places which have an umbrella over them, and they're popular because you can look from the south end of the second deep pond uh, right through to the White Street. You can see where the water comes through. Uh, and right there's a stone arch bridge. And why would it be there? Well, we know that when the railroad went in, it went in West Urbana, which was at least 5 miles away from East Urbana, and you're not always sure that it may have been that the geological structure was appropriate for the line to be put there. Sometimes in some communities, uh, the main town didn't really enjoy having uh, steam engines come through. So sometimes there's politics behind this sort of thing. Uh, it may depend on who owned what land at what time. But the main line, Illinois Central line, uh, was away from downtown Urbana and the county seat. So a little railroad line was put in. It was first drawn by horses. Later, as after 1900, when electricity was corralled, then it was an electric line to uh, the Champaign side. West Urbana became Champaign. And in Champaign, because it was close to the railroad line, it was more commercial than Urbana. So the electrified line went to Wright Street, the border between the two towns, and you had to go by horse for the rest of the way. Eventually, that changed. The little line, urban line, went through to Urbana, and just recently, you can the street outside the courthouse was opened up, and you could see the railroad ties there that belonged to the old uh, connecting railroad. So the bridge is the last element of this railroad line. Most of the other parts of the line have been what is called consumed. That means sold and developed. But you can see the elements of it all the way to Urbana. And now we're back up. We've gone down into probably 50 feet deep detention pond that only fills when there is a serious storm, so 5 or 8 inches of water, rainfall. But the rest of the time, the detention pond has trails in it or walkways that are rather wonderful. Keep in mind that I'm still talking to my sister, and I'm prone to looking at the ducks. This walkway that is on the natural level, up higher than the detention pond, attracts ducks, and once again, young folk with feeding the creatures. There's an aggregation of all sorts of creatures. There are black ducks. There are mallards with interesting greens for their heads. There are the 3 white ducks. There are serious geese. One of them could hear my sister calling from Australia and had its head cocked on side a little in curiosity. The ducks were harvesting roots, which goes back to the fact that these creatures can create erosion. And, there's enough food on those often perennial roots that are alive during winter, waiting to come out again in spring. I talk to people occasionally and suggest that they don't do too much feeding of the creatures, but it's like a small zoo, and you almost want to let young people, especially, uh, 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 be aware of the language of the creatures, the movement of the creatures. They are quite independent of humans. They tend to react with each other. You can get to tell that some are more aggressive than others. There are mating behaviors where the males are flying after females, and the females are not enjoying that, but possibly will enjoy and reproduce. And that can be a problem because sometimes you can have nests hidden in the surrounds of the pond, and a goose might have 8 young ones, so population can grow very quickly. I walk along and watch. Sometimes the White Street Bridge allows people to fish the pond. I'm not sure whether it's stocked, but often these ponds are stocked with fish. And the heron that comes every once in a while catches fish. So there's fish in there, whether it's from the boneyard or from being stocked. So I'm walking along the upper layer of the upper walkway, which has a monumental entrance, which is a part of the old hospital, Burnham Hospital, which was closed out, and so a reminder remnant is part of a stairwell. So people tend to sit on that stairwell. And sometimes they get photographed because they're getting married, and there's a accumulation of young folk that enjoy getting together on the plaza that's outside. I'm walking now towards the uh, smaller pond and watching the meanders that have been made in the boneyard. Uh, Rivers tend to have meanders because if you take a piece of steel and push it with your hands on either end, it will suddenly go into a sigmoid curve. That's where the least resistance is. That's the physical state. Well, the same happens with water. If you block the passage of water, then the water behind will cause a sigmoid curve, and those meanders have characters. They have parts of them that where the meander will cut, and parts where it will dump material as a beach. And so the designers of this uh, complex have been careful to retain some of that meandering structure. Uh, so I watch uh, the dog population. This is a rather interesting park. The dogs are often on leashes, but there's enough room for dogs to do a little wandering and inspecting themselves. So there's one gentleman who has an extended, uh, what would you call it? It's uh, a projectile so that you can throw a ball 100 yards, and the dog will chase after it. The dog is exercising, and it's going at a really rapid rate, and it has a smell capacity that will take it to the ball, find it, it'll turn around, come back, and then very shortly it's standing in front of its owner with its head up, and it's barking and barking for another excursion. Uh, That can happen, but eventually the slingshot gets put away, and then the dog will perhaps take a swim in the boneyard. It's cold, but this is a Labrador type dog, and it knows that that's a fun place to be. It comes out dripping wet and across the walkway, and its paw marks are in uh, the walkway. There are 2 or 3 little plots of prairie there that came from the pocket prairie, and I tend to work with them. And when I have a dog like this one that wants to bark at you and be recognized, or uh, have some territorial right, I tend not to recognize. But eventually it'll stop barking at me. But it's gotten to be knowing me now, so I can say hi and treat it as a friendly animal and go on. Uh, but it's interesting to watch this dog sniff around uh, once its running period has been uh, shut. There's all sorts of other interesting places to nudge and be. Uh, it's an intelligent dog, and it is very much attached to its owner. Uh, The prairie itself is tall and dead. It's basically perennial, so the plants usually will stay up during winter. Uh, they might be a place for an occasional blackbird or a creature, but mostly just dead. And interesting because dead flowers do, in their own right, have a beauty and artistry. It's not usually understood because these plots look very different than uh, a vacant lawn. Uh, but this is how they uh, live and grow. Uh, I walk around and up the side there is big blue stem and it falls in like you had skittles in your hand and they fall all over the place. And for some people, that's not awfully interesting because it's not tidy. But for me, I know that that is how that particular plant falls in the winter. Other plants, Indian grass or switchgrass or cordgrass, all have their own characteristics. And if you take time to enjoy them, it can be a lot of fun. So I'm still walking around. I've terminated my conversation with my sister, who's rather wonderful, but is quite capable of shouting at me a little. But I go around the circuit several times. To the south, there is a third area which is under the control of the park district. It's called Scott Park. I I think it's named after a previous mayor, but it has a rain garden. As the uh, water is allowed out of the detention pond slowly, so it doesn't flood the commercial area, it can be pumped out slowly, uh, and the boneyard again is meandering and is respectful in the sense that it is another rain garden, quite different rain garden, one that's more natural than the one on University Avenue, uh, but put in by people who knew about uh, the ecology. So we can walk around that and watch what's going. There's a tendency to decapitate the heads of the fruiting bodies of some plants, like monarda, for instance. But really, they look better uh, just left there, unless you need the seed, and then you can decapitate and be legitimate. Now, that area is adjacent to uh, recreational facilities, a basketball court, a kiosk for people to play cards in, or uh, so there's this juxtaposition. And around it, there are a couple of flower beds that uh, the organizers of the more ecological uh, rain garden have put there and put in uh, a one species representation of part of the prairie, uh, just to remind you that prairie species can look interesting too. You don't have to have bigger flowers and more flowers that happen when native plants are bred to be more showy. These wild expressions, and uh, there are going to be fewer flowers, but they mingle with each other. Bee balm, for instance, is purple and comes out at a time when uh, yellow coneflowers are in action. So a bed with just those two species can be quite interesting. one of those beds was Culver's root, and it has an interesting uh, candelabra or style inflorescence uh, that is attractive if you know what you're looking at. One of the difficulties is that we have people who maintain these areas who don't always know the native species and can treat them as weeds. And so we that's why we have not master gardener programs and master naturalist programs. So we have people who work with the cities and the park districts and know how to express. One of those plots has been planted to non prairie plants, and I mean to write a note about that because I think that plot was there purposely to give people a transition between uh, human intervention and human recreation and the rain garden plot. Uh, so just walking around the the detention pond is rather wonderful, and you take an excursion here and there that brings you to other small features, even just brick streets or areas that are developing quickly, and so you've lost old houses to vacant lots that might be sold for development. You watch trains go by, and the trains are very long, so the, the tail of the train that is going north, uh, the head of it will be at Bradley Avenue, which is uh, at least a mile away. And uh, that train can be more than a mile long, so some of the corridors get clogged. There's uh, thought about the length of trains. Some of them are 200 cars long. Some of the local trains that go out to pick up grain are much shorter, but so you can hear the whistles where the driver of the engine is letting the uh, roundhouse know uh, that they're at Bradley Avenue and they're prepared to go through it, which will stop traffic for at least 10 minutes. Yeah, that means that you have to organize it so the train doesn't arrive at peak hour time, whether it's in the morning or the night. Not always possible. So it's important that the train come into town and move through fairly quickly. If you're an engineer, you would have to think about taking Bradley over three lines, and it's almost impossible to do. So the traffic will recognize that there's a train there, and then they'll back off and take an alternate route and come drive under at Washington and avoid waiting for hours. So there's a little turnaround if the train is recognized and it's starting to move across several tracks and perhaps park. The roundhouse that I made a mention to was where steam engines and later diesel engines could be repaired and uh, perhaps turned around. They were a round circle, and that's where you got the idea of a roundhouse. So you could put your steam engine on it and turn it round so that it could take an alternate route uh, and join a train in a different manner. These were yards that were uh, hump yards. That's where you take a manifest train. A manifest train is one that has a lot of different freight on it. It's not just all grain or all coal or uh, a passenger train, and push those freight cars into different sidings so that you can assemble uh, various trains that go in different directions. It was round because that's you were dealing with a device that was circular. Uh, Now, I think that's my walk for the day. I would like to think of trying to story tell because I think storytelling is rather important in the sort of game that I'm in. It has to be reasonably simple. It has to be fun. It has to have some people involved. My sister, for instance, and I will probably do more of this because I think it's helpful to listeners to know that we convert this to uh, video, and uh, I can take as I walk cell phone pictures that are not the most perfect, but they're there, and they're there when the occasion is prominent. It might be a goose that's flapping its wings, or uh, it might be a little snake in the grass, which bothers some people. We find that to be part of biodiversity. I have a rant, and it is this: I have over the years, I'm close to a couple of dumpsters. One, a cardboard dumpster we organized because cardboard was going into the landfill. And over the years, I've removed perhaps 100 tons of materials that I think should not go to the landfill. Uh, we don't have good recycling at this time, but part of that salvage is plastic that comes to restaurants. And it's sad that often it goes to the landfill. But recently, I've been listening to programs, and it is fairly obvious that that plastic gets uh, bulked and sent to places like Indianapolis or Chicago, and there is no place for it to go. So eventually it goes to the landfill or to the oceans. And so these last few weeks have been rather sad to know that much of the salvage that I pulled out of dumpsters, sometimes I could go to a totally full dumpster and reduce it to um, a foot or two, the rest being salvageable materials, uh, some of them reusable. But to know that that plastic is ending up in the oceans is a serious problem. And Greenpeace is into this. They they realize that a lot of the creatures in the oceans, especially, do not understand plastic, and they swallow them. And if they do that, the only way a veterinarian can deal with the problem is to open up the stomach or the intestine where there is a blockage and remove the blockage, which is a fairly serious operation. Uh, we obviously need researchers who can take plastic of various types. Some of the hard plastics, especially, are very difficult to work with. Uh, they have chemical bases that are not easy to uh, separate and costly to separate. But I think as world stewards, we have the responsibility to know that uh, our plastics are being considered as uh, important waste that could be reusable. We do have some waste that goes into fence posts and other items, but there seems to be a disjunct at the moment about what we do with plastic. And I wonder what our city is doing and whether ABC is the contractor and whether ABC takes baled plastic to places like Indianapolis and what happens to it when it gets to Indianapolis is the question that we need to know. That means we have to have some surveillance, and that hasn't always been ideal. We have laws, but often we do not have teeth in those laws and no way of checking out. Sometimes we find aluminum cans that go to the landfill because nobody's watching, and that's the easiest thing to do. Glass is the same problem. I would like to think that we could have landfills for special materials. I'd have a landfill for plastic, a landfill for aluminum, a landfill for glass. Glass is heavy, but we're running out of uh, sand. The world has been putting most of its sand into concrete buildings, and so we have to think about what we do with glass, which is a product of uh, the melting of sand and special types of sand for special types of glass. It's heavy. To take a load of glass to Streeter to have it processed is a serious task. I've been this day talking to people in the area of Monticello to Clinton. We have 33 miles of railroad bed out there, and it's vulnerable. And there are always people who would see the conservation area along the railroad bed as weedy and uh, with trees in it that overshadow the land of adjacent areas. Uh, but we are seriously hoping that uh, the success of the Kickapoo Trail and a trail in Monticello will encourage the extension of that corridor to Clinton as a trail. It won't be a rail trail that can be reused by rail, but it will go past small communities of uh, White Heath, Shady Rest, Lodge, DeLand, Weldon, Lane, and Weldon Springs to Clinton. Uh, it's a rather wonderful potential, but uh, there are people who would like to buy that land and and instead do corn and soybeans. So I've been discussing with a realtor. Uh, he manages farms that are adjacent to our railbed. So we have to talk about titles and deeds and what we might want to do. And I'm thinking that the time has come when we need to move and shake that 33 miles. Uh, the East Central Illinois has been very reluctant to encourage these trails. They're everywhere else in the rest of the country, but the soils in East Central Illinois are so valuable that invariably when uh, people have tried to preserve abandoning railroads, they have had a lot of a challenge from people who want that extra 100 feet of right of way. They remove the ballast and plant corn. Sometimes you can go to such a railroad line that has been consumed, and the natural vitality of the land underneath means that the corn that's on either side is 10 inches shorter than the corn that's on the virgin land that's between. It's a good indication that we've, in a matter of 100 years, utilized a lot of our soil and a lot of our genetic material that is on those railroad lines. We just lost one in the Paris to Arcola to Lovington to Decatur line, which was not a suitable railroad trail because there were gaps where the land had been sold and no one was going to be able to get the land back. But the prairie on either side was rich, and I go to meetings and suggest that. So this week, if I am right with my schedule, I will talk to the Grand Prairie Friends, whom we initiated with the mission of preserving prairie very successfully. They have been working in Coles County and now have 100 acres of uh, mixed forest on the Umbra River, and they've acquired in the vicinity of 1,000 acres of land. Very good conservation, and we're proud of that. But the fact that they have moved away from being advocates for prairie is a little sad. And so I will perhaps want to suggest that they might think about working with the 33 miles that we have from Monticello to Clinton and between Monticello and Armenia, which is adjacent to Allerton Park. How do we move and shake these pieces of land? Shady Rest has gone to the Piatt County Forest Preserve for in perpetuity preservation. Other plots can go elsewhere. We're re-railing between Whiteheath and Seymour and trying to preserve active line between Seymour and Champaign with the aim of getting historic trains into Champaign. That's being handled by railroad engineers, basically the Scott family, and it's a lot of work. We have facilitated same by providing an easement. That means the railroad has the ballast and on either side, but the rest remains in prairie. That's provided that the electrical system there does not get to be herbicided, which often happens since Ameren has moved to herbiciding rather than use chainsaws to remove trees. But if the herbicide is designed to keep out a tree for 3 years, you've lost your prairie that we bought the area for. So we're thinking of these things, and we want you to think about them too, to visit these trails, to visit the networks from Bloomington to Decatur to Danville to Champaign-Urbana, to not only provide for recreation, but to preserve some of the only prairie that is left. It's not the best, but it's all we have. And we need that genealogy. With that, it's time to close. I'll leave a little time for WEFT and UPTV to add information that helps the public know that these two agencies do a wonderful job of informing people of small elements that really put communities together. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial, and the 24th of January. Bye.